Hi, welcome to Culturally Determined on Blog TV. My name is Aryeh Cohen-Wade, and I'm your host. And my guest today is Peter Moskos. Peter, could you introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm Peter Moskos. I'm a professor of law and police science at John Jay College of Criminal Justice.
Thanks for coming on. Longtime viewers may remember you appearing a couple times in the past. And I think I first became aware of your work through the book In Defense of Flogging, which came out, I guess, about a decade ago, which was a very interesting book that was kind of a Swiftian sort of take on what happens with crime and punishment in this country, especially prisons. And you've also written a book called Cop in the Hood. And we're going to be talking about the obvious topic in terms of...
That's my third book, Greek Americans, right? No one ever talks about that one.
Oh, okay. I'm not familiar with that one. What is that book?
It's Greek Americans. It's about the immigrant experience, but anyway.
Okay, interesting. Okay, so we'll include links to those below.
That's the one that no one's ever read, but anyway.
Okay, so I thought of you as someone. So and please correct anything. So I haven't read Cop in the Hood, but I've heard you talk about it. So please correct anything I get wrong. As part of your PhD research, you worked as a police officer in Baltimore in the 90s, or was it in the 2000s?
It was from 99 to 2001.
Okay. And so you have a lot of people talking about the police right now. And I think you have a unique perspective on what it's actually like to be a police officer. But I've also, I thought of you also because, the debate over the police is so tribalized, and there's kind of people saying like, Blue Lives Matter, and we respect basically rah pro police all the time. Maybe they make a few mistakes, but like we need them. And then on the other side, you have the people saying all cops are bastards, defund the police. Throw a rock at a cop. That's a good thing to do. And so I see you as someone in the middle who can maybe help us understand these important matters more. So what have you been thinking? It's an open-ended question, since in the past 2 weeks, as the video footage of the police officer killing an unarmed man in Minneapolis came out, and then the protests and everything's happened after that.
For the first week or 10 days, I was really just depressed about the whole thing. I mean, from the video, which is horrible and depressing, but also I didn't see, and then I think protests that were too non-specific in goals, or the goals that they were specific about are too broad to be attainable. There's also a difference this time. In the past, protests about people killed by police have been about accountability and justice. And this time was different because the killing was universally condemned by police officers, by police unions even. I've never seen that before. The cop was fired, cops were fired, and arrested and charged. In the past, that has been the main demand, that level of accountability. And this time it happened. So I'm like, well, I don't quite get the end game here. I don't quite understand why people are taking out their anger against cops in New York City for what some guy in Minneapolis did. More recently, in the past few days, I've started to lift out of my funk because I do see some productive changes. Let me also if history is any guide, the looting and violence that went along with the protests, that I don't want to conflate the two, but at the same time, that's never helped a neighborhood or a group or anything in America before. I watched Baltimore burn in 2015, and the city's never recovered. So it's like, well, I don't want things to get worse. And the idea that, we're going to change, we're going to reform, what does that mean? We need specifics. I think we're starting to see a little bit of some productive change. Police departments are culturally resistant to any kind of change. And yet, despite that, over decades, there has been change in policing, by and large, vastly for the better. So if this is a moment where we can capitalize it and actually improve things in a good way. Maybe. We'll see. But I think it's to fix things, you have to identify the problem. And if you just say police are bastards, that's not really productive, despite how passionate your feeling might be, and perhaps even, justified in experience or whatever. But I don't know. We shall see.
Yeah. I guess a couple of things that surprised me were how quickly both how quickly the video and the actions of the officer Chauvin, if that's how you pronounce his name, were so universally condemned. You feel like 99.5% of anyone out there is condemning them, and then also how quickly the protests spread all over the country and even the world. And so in the previous kind of wave of protests sparked from killing black men, if there was like a violent protest or something, it was usually in the place where the town or city where that happened, and then maybe there'd be some like less intense protests elsewhere, but those would fade away, and that's not happened. So one obvious explanation is it's the quarantine, and people have been locked in their house for 3 months, and then they have all this pent up energy, and they're really angry, and you can't, yell at a virus or anything. So this was an escape valve for all that.
That's got to be part of it. I don't want to say it's the major part, but certainly that's got to be a contributing factor to the size of the protest and the demographics of the protest.
Right.
I've never seen so many white people protesting.
Yeah, and then I think another thing is just maybe a sense that nothing had changed after these awful events happened that were captured on videotape, and just a sense of a loss of legitimacy among people who are maybe somewhat like me, who like white people who live in a city, who are educated, who maybe never had a bad personal interaction with the cops, but they've seen the videos, they've heard the stories. And so they do not have a positive feeling about the cops. And they also don't have a memory of like the 80s crime wave in which maybe the cops are seen as like the heroes of that story or something. So they're ready to say, fuck the cops in a way that they wouldn't have, 10 or 15 years ago.
Yeah. And I think it's tough though look, I try and look at things. I try research. In my research, look, I talk to people, but I also try and use data. And it's frustrating if you have data and nobody cares. And if not only that, but by presenting data, you're accused of contextualizing and whataboutism. And I don't fully know how to balance that. The video is horrible. If you don't have a visceral reaction against what you saw, something's wrong with you. So there is that factor. The people's anger is legitimate. But they're also like the idea that nothing has changed. Last night I tweeted quite innocently a graph of shootings by cops in New York City going back to 1973. Because I honestly was trying to get data for other cities because I was speaking to a reporter who was asking about it. And I was like, I don't know if it exists for other cities going back that far. And I said asking for a friend, which maybe sounded like I was trying to make a comment more than I was really asking for a friend. But for my minor Twitter presence, it got a couple hundred retweets and likes, which is a lot for me. And I was kind of shocked because people didn't know this, and I forget this because I teach it every semester. And I think I saw what you tweeted actually. So there's been a strong decline since the 70s of the number of times cops have shot. Yeah, strong is an understatement. There was a time when cops were shooting somebody every day in New York City. In more recent years, New York City cops shot about 40 people a year. But for many years back in the 70s and 80s, it was more than 100 people a year. Last year it was 15, which is, I think, the lowest ever. But that is part of a long, extreme downward trend. I mean, we're talking, it's a reduction that did not happen by accident or chance. It happened because the NYPD started caring about cops shooting people back in the 70s and into the 80s. And the New York City Police Department implemented policy that basically became the foundation for Tennessee versus Garner, which, to oversimplify, it says you can't shoot a fleeing felon in the back just because he's running away, absent of any other threat. That policy became standard for policing nationwide, and not only did it reduce the number of people shot by cops, it almost certainly reduced the number of cops shot, and in effect de-escalated the streets because some number of cops were getting shot by people who were shooting back, basically. Mm-hmm. The NYPD did it by basically saying we're going to keep track of every bullet that's fired by a cop, which now seems common sense, but before that it wasn't that way. But it saved hundreds of lives in New York City alone. New York City right now has, by every measure you can quantify, has good numbers. And I mean by good numbers, I mean declining arrests. Right now, murder actually is skyrocketing this year in the city, but generally declining murder and very few uses of force, lethal and non-lethal. It's a great success story, but that doesn't mean bad things are going to happen, or it doesn't mean bad things aren't going to happen. Mm-hmm. But it doesn't mean we could learn from cities and departments that do things right. And that's one of my, even if we improve policing, when I get sad about the whole thing, I go, what's the point? Because cops are going to be in another bad killing. It's guaranteed. There are just too many police departments. We're talking 17,000 plus separate police departments. There are too many cops. We're talking 750,000 cops for one of them not to do something stupid and criminally wrong. So what are we going to do then? We can ask for perfection, and we can demand improvement, but we're not going to get perfection. And I worry about the future when we demand perfection, or else, cities get busted up. Mm-hmm. So we need some way to improve policing, and also some way to contextualize things and say, okay, yes, this bad thing happened, but here's what went wrong. Here's what we can do to prevent it. Here's how we're holding departments accountable. And a lot of that hasn't been done yet. So this is still progress to be made. But we're never going to have a country where this doesn't happen. All we can do is reduce the frequency of it. Mm-hmm. Unless we abolish police, and then we'll have greater problems, but at least it won't be coming from cops.
Okay, we'll hold that for maybe later in this conversation. That whole movement. So I mean, part of it is, it's crazy to think that the police were shooting like over 300, one person a day in New York City in the 70s or something. How many of those were caught on film? Probably zero.
Zero. And but they didn't even have to fill out a paperwork until then. Like, that was the amazing. You just had to buy more ammo.
So would that even have been reported in the newspaper or something if that happened, or
there were too many? I mean, maybe it'd be there are more papers, right? So maybe there'd be some minor story. But if you didn't hit anybody, there would be no one would know about it if you missed. And the cops' aim, perhaps luckily, was incredibly bad back then as well. But the shooting incidents,
the guns were probably also less.
In one of the first years they started counting, there were close to 1,000 shooting incidents. That's 3 a day, or 2.5 a day. Whatever. But I mean, good God, that's a lot.
Yeah. And so the information technology angle of this has to play a role, and we're still in this very early part of living in a civilization where everyone has a camera and the ability to instantly broadcast something globally at any moment. And this is, has been playing out in lots of different areas of life where, there'll be some confrontation between neighbors or people in line at Starbucks or something, and someone says something offensive, and then everyone, within 12 hours knows who this person is. So the Chauvin murdering Floyd by kneeling on him for 10 minutes, that, if we didn't have the video evidence, I have a hard time seeing this playing out in the way it did. So someone was there filming, and it showed the other 3 cops not intervening. Maybe that's a little hard to imagine if you don't see it, and also all this, so maybe that explains part of the paradox of, where was the outrage 30, 40 years ago when cops were shooting with more impunity versus now. There certainly
was outrage. I mean, every I don't know if it's every, but I'm going to say every, even if it's not true, every single bit of urban unrest in the past 100 years in America has been sparked by real or perceived police misconduct. There might be a few exceptions, but basically that's true. So there was certainly outrage, but it happened in different ways. And sometimes, it's just rumors of things going on. In this case, it probably would have come out because there was body camera footage. The initial report, which was kind of a lie, or at least a grave mistruth or omission of truth, but did say all the body cams were activated. So it would have come out at some point, I think, but in a different way.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so then, protests are sparked and people are very upset, and there's kind of a residue of the Black Lives Matter movement that started in the previous decade. And then so then there's an additional wave of outrages on the part of both protesters / looters / rioters and the police. Okay, this is maybe
I put ands in there, not slashes. Just
okay, true. So there's peaceful protesters, there's people who want to fuck shit up, and then there's people who are like, I want to go get some luxury goods from a store in Soho. It seems like the latter, the looting, especially in New York City, was like, I don't know, like people were like ready to go. Like they had cars, they had, that was like organized, and they were, this wasn't just like an opportunistic kind of thing, like someone, like throwing the, do the right thing, throwing the, the trash can through the window of Sal's. It seemed like, I don't know, it's weird. I'm not a conspiracy person, but the fact that all these places were unguarded and also there were all these people ready to go into them and steal expensive stuff is somewhat strange to me. It
also did not help that orders from above in the NYPD said basically take a hands-off approach, and in a large organization, when those are the instructions from the mayor through the police commissioner, like police should have done more. They should have had better intelligence too, but they should have done more in the beginning. And there was a slow reaction, but that was unfortunately by design from up above.
So you think that's from de Blasio essentially?
Yeah.
Go easy on people?
Well, because he was thinking of protesters and he wasn't thinking of the looting. But the orders, when they come down, say, if you're told, well, don't arrest someone, don't make arrests. That puts cops in a weird position on the street.
Mm-hmm. And so do you think that, you can imagine if suddenly, like, it seems like the streets are lawless, there's a certain type of person, and maybe it's some sizable percentage of people who are walking around who are thinking like, okay, now's my chance to grab some stuff. But then there's also kind of like people who are ready to go and, had the tire iron or whatever, like in their hands already. I mean, does this make sense? Like how much was opportunistic? How much was maybe people were like doing like an operation or something? This sounds weird.
I got no clue. I mean, some of both. At some point, it's a street party. At some point, people are saying that we're going to go in and with a goal of grabbing stuff. I don't know. I try and stay away from mobs and riots and vandalism. No good's coming from me being there.
Right. Okay. So then, if the police were given a hands-off order in New York City on the first night of the looting, it seems like the order changed after that because we saw a lot of very aggressive, abusive behavior also being captured by people with cell phones, obviously expanding beyond New York City to other places like the clearing of the Lafayette Square Park, whatever, in DC, and so in those kind of situations, like how do you think the cops? How do they think, the cops are thinking? So did you see the clip where it's like, I guess maybe like curfew had just come down in New York City, and there's a guy riding his bike across the street, and then like a cop is like just starts wailing on him, and then like four other cops like come to like take him down, and he was just trying to get wherever.
I think I did. There's so many of them. It's hard to.
Right. So what do you? I mean, all cops are bastards. People are like, okay, these are violent assholes. And they've been waiting for an excuse to crack some fucking skulls, and now they get to do it with impunity. And I guess the opposite perspective would be, they're just trying to keep law and order. They're doing their best. It's a confusing situation. And sometimes, some level of violence is needed to bring order. So what do you think they're thinking at this point?
I wouldn't say some level of violence is needed to bring order, but I do think it's important to say that some level of force is needed to bring order in that situation. And I feel there is a disconnect between the realities of post-curfew crowd management and what people, especially people, I would say, who don't have a lot of interactions with the police, how they think police are going to act. The idea that, well, because I'm standing here unarmed, I have a right to be here even after you tell me not to be. That's not the way it works. I also remember I said something early on, like, this pains me because people are going to get hurt. And I didn't mean that as a threat or a promise, just as resignation. That's what happens in these situations. We don't have some peaceful way to clear the streets once the order is given. Now, you can say the streets should never be cleared, but after what happened in New York City, I think most people said that we need order. There's a manual for that, and it's not necessarily a pretty manual, but it involves telling people to leave. That's an important first step. Like that apparently didn't happen in Washington, but that was not a municipal police department doing that. Right. But once cops tell you to leave, you don't have a choice. Now you can say, oh, sure, I do. Okay. But then cops are allowed to use force. And there's a very specific way that cops advance a line, and anyone that does not move, who gets on the backside of that line, gets arrested. Cops are trained to strike people, to hit people in that situation, not to beat them for no reason, but and this may be revealing, from my 6 hours of training, of riot training, they said this is the one time we'll tell you it's okay to hit people. Strike people is the term, and it's with your club. In some ways, it's amazing how so a lot of the use of force videos, I say, look, yes, it's bad, it's ugly, but that actually is what we're asking cops to do. Now, we could ask cops to do something else again, but that's what we're asking cops to do, and that's where the cops start to feel that they can't win. Because look, your New York City cop is majority minority. There are lots of immigrants and kids of immigrants. It's more non-white than the protesters. Generally, it depends on the protest. And you've got, some young white kid yelling at some older black cop, calling her racist. Like, there's some absurdity to it from the cop perspective. They don't want to be there. They don't understand why they're being held responsible for something that they didn't kill that guy in Minneapolis. It's not, but you can say, well, it's like Eric Garner. Okay. But at some point, it is collective punishment. If you throw things at cops for something that happened somewhere else. So no cops don't like that. They're working 12-hour shifts. They just got over COVID where, what is it? I forget if it's 15 or 20% of the department, got it. It's been a really rough time for the NYPD, and now this. So no, they're not happy, and they're cranky, and some cops behave better than others, and some cops behave horribly, and you do have to call them out. But I wish I had a sort of some solution to that. But the idea that, we don't have to follow cops' orders, and then we get upset when cops use force. Civil disobedience said, okay, we're going to do this, and we understand we're going to get arrested. And we also have clear goals, and, we're doing this to win the PR game. But this is just much more chaotic. And for some people, it says, look, we've shown cops for who they really are. Okay, maybe. But I don't see it as productive in its goals.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I guess this, in some ways, it just gets back to this idea that there's, three quarters of a million cops out there. One of them is going to do something pretty bad every day in this giant country, and in this time of extreme stress. Maybe that explains some of it. I mean, also there's been very bad behavior, much of it caught on camera. The officers who cleared the square in Washington, with their plastic shields and swinging and punching that cameraman in the face, like, that's insane. That seems like something out of RoboCop or something like a
Yeah, and I
fascist,
don't know which
fascist police
specific
thing.
cops did that, but between the park police and these mysterious, unnamed federal agencies,
Yes, it seems like a recipe for disaster.
yeah, it's
The
a
entire
recipe
thing.
for disaster. And, they're following the orders of their dear leader, and that's another problem. Municipal cops are nominally under civilian control, under the mayor. And I'm sure I'll get accused of this anyway. I don't mean to apologize for bad behavior. I'm trying to explain what happens. And look, the NYPD arrested a cop yesterday. We'll see if there are other arrests coming. There is some accountability there. NYPD, by the way, it's not well known. On an average year, they might arrest 100 cops, which seems like a lot in some ways, but whatever. They're 35,000 cops. And most of it's for off-duty action. And in the past, if a cop were to be arrested for something on duty, it would have to be at a much greater level of negligence. But you do need to say certain behavior is unacceptable. But my issue is that you see places where cops are not actually doing wrong; they're just using force, and that's and to say that that's incorrect behavior is sort of it's a misunderstanding of what we ask police to do.
What do you think about the militarization of the police, which is evident in these giant tank-like vehicles they have and the body armor that they're wearing, and also the kind of, dispersal technology they have, which maybe is not militarization exactly, but, these pepper balls. I'm learning all sorts of new things that exist in the world that I didn't know about before. And which are kind of like a rubber bullet type thing combined with pepper spray and there was the
first ever use of the pepper ball, and by police in America, by the way. It killed a woman in Boston after the Red Sox won the World Series, and that put a hold on pepper ball use for many years. Anytime you have a projectile, it was horrible. Snellgrave, I think was her name, shot her in the eye and killed her. It's a horrible way to die. Because a sergeant was just lobbing it into the crowd. Anytime you shoot projectiles from a gun, there's a great potential for danger. In other countries, they tend to be a lot quicker with tear gas. We don't use tear gas or dogs because it's a legacy of the civil rights movement. The alternative to tear gas, there's some other weird things being invented that I hope we don't go down those roads, but batons and pushing people is sort of the alternative to mass use of tear gas that American police tend to subscribe to. I mean, the militarization, it's the debate has been going on for a long time, since the invention of the SWAT team in LA back in the days. I think it's, if I have to say, if I'm for or against the militarization of police, I'm against it. But that said, what do you do in mass shooter situations? You do need some kind of armored vehicle that's available. We are asking cops to, confront potential suicide bombers in a terrorism situation. So you have to balance that. And then what happens is you give cops these toys, some of which they shouldn't have, but some of which they should. Then they have to use them. So you end up using these over-militarized responses to, say, routine warrants. And that, I think, is bad. But you do need to train cops in this, but it shouldn't be at the expense of citizens. 98% of warrants should first be tried by knocking on someone's door. And, you can take it from there. But that would solve a lot of the problems. We collectively, we do control police departments. Sometimes, as difficult as it is, we can decide what we want them to have. But do we want to say just take away? I guess it's hard to say what militarized means, is all I'm saying. Though, like the Supreme Court definition of pornography, sometimes you know it when you see it. And you can say, no, that's just not necessary. I think we saw some of that in Ferguson, by the way, and that shocked a lot of people. But we're giving military surplus to cops. We can choose not to. And to some extent, we should choose not to. But every little department doesn't need a SWAT team. But there does have to be some available SWAT team in the region to respond to situations where someone's, firing an automatic weapon outside a window. Cops have to respond to that too. So we're never going to have a demilitarized police. It's a question of how it's used. It's always complicated. That's the problem. There's nuance here.
Yes, I agree. And I mean, this is somewhat parallel thing to the main discussion, but like, there's in my opinion, the unstated facts in the running conflict between the police and the populace is the massive number of guns in America. And so the cops have a very, it's very logical for the cops to fear that anytime they're arresting someone, pulling over someone on the highway or whatever, this person is packing heat and maybe they're ready to, go out in a blaze of glory or something. And so as far as I know, there haven't been protesters shooting back at the cops, but you can certainly imagine that happening. There's like more guns than people in America.
The cops have been shot and killed in these recent days. So
so it's we live in a violent country in which it's very easy to get access to a gun, and if you can snap your fingers and all the guns disappeared, maybe there'd be some sort of different way of doing things. But I don't, you can't take I don't see the guns ever being taken away from the cops, because the populace still has the guns, and some number of criminals have guns, and some level of law-abiding people have guns, and then you have this the other previous situation in Minneapolis. It was the guy's name, Philando Castile. Was that one where he was like telling the officer that he had a legal gun in his car, and there was confusion, and he ended up getting shot and killed. But the cop shot and killed him. I should. One change is the passive voice, voice thing and all this. That I do approve of changing that. But so the cop shot and killed him, and and in most other countries, there's not this level of firepower in the populace.
But even firepower be damned, that was a bad shooting. When I see these things, the first thing I kind of think of is, if I were in that situation, what would have I done? And in that situation, I'm like, what is this guy? I mean, that cop was not, he was afraid for no reason. And that was the problem. So I want to sort of place the blame firmly there. But the gun situation, to compare, I spent a semester at the National Policing College in England, which was then in rural Hampshire in the South. And I did a lot of ride-alongs with cops there, and I asked them, when's the last time a cop here was killed? And this is a county, a large county in England. And they said, do car crashes count? And I was like, no, I mean, killed, not died, killed. And the guy said, I think never. The idea that you could have a large conglomeration, a region of England where the number of cop fatalities in over a century is zero. And he said maybe there's one I don't know about, but zero or damn close to zero is hard to imagine from an American perspective. And absolutely that changes policing. We have a problem with guns and gun violence in this country. But we have a problem with racism and violence in this country too. That what just frustrates me is we tend not to deal with the actual problems until police do, and then we blame cops for screwing things up. And again, if they screw things up, they deserve some blame. But if we could magically fix policing, and I don't quite know what that means, because sometimes we want cops to shoot people. I mean, that not often, but that needs to be said. That's part of the reason we have police, and we certainly have police because they can use force. Otherwise, we wouldn't need police. That has to be part of the equation. And if we can set up a utopian society, great. I don't know if this is perhaps a good segue into, defunding and abolition. You said you were going to go to that. But,
I did want to ask about one other incident, which it was in the news once again today because our president, Trump, tweeted about it, which is this, the cops in Buffalo pushing over an elderly man. He fell to the ground and hit his head on the ground and was bleeding out of his ears, apparently still in the hospital. And Trump suggested that maybe he was some sort of Antifa provocateur, which is insane. He was, he's just like some old hippie or something. So there's that incident. You mentioned pushing as something that the police, if they're clearing an area, pushing makes sense. So I guess I would want you to please tell us what you think about that incident that was captured on video, but also that there was the two cops who pushed him were charged with something, I think, or put on leave or something. They were arrested. And then a bunch of other cops out of uniform gathered outside, where they were being processed or whatever. And, when they came out, were like clapping and cheering for them. And I was just thinking, like, this is a job where there's like this very, very strong loyalty, like tribal opinion. It's like, us against them kind of thing. Like if a colleague of mine pushed an old man onto the ground, I would probably be like, okay, let's wait to figure out what really happened before I'm like clapping and cheering for them.
Yeah, this is where cops are not good at PR for policing, and cops can be their worst enemy, and they're not thinking or don't care how this is perceived. The issue from the cop perspective is not what they did, it's how they're treated by the department. The issue is, this is a case where people do not have the option of stopping that police line. The cops were trained to use force. One person, can't. It's not going to be, well, it could be, Tiananmen Square type thing where one person stops the march. That's the purpose. They're told to leave. He chooses not to. He's either going to get pushed back or taken to the other side of the line and arrested. It ended tragically. It's not clear if he's ever going to recover from this. But that's how, and there were medics in the second row. To me, also, when I watched this, like, well, you can't leave them there. Then you have to render aid. But it was actually a reporter who said, actually, there were medics there, and they did call for help right away. They had a system. Mm-hmm. Now, we can say the system is wrong, but then blame the police department, blame the mayor, blame the bosses there. The cops are saying, we are doing exactly what you told us to do. And now you're throwing us under the bus and you're not taking responsibility. That's the issue. It's not so much when cops misbehave and gets in trouble. It's when they say, this is what you told us to do. And now we're getting in trouble for it. That's the issue there. And that's why they said, we're not going to work in this unit, because you've just changed the rules on us. Mm-hmm. You've just said everything you taught and trained us is not true. So that's the situation. Then it makes it look like they're celebrating pushing an old man to the ground, and Trump doesn't help matters with that. But it's about this, it's an organizational problem. And the lack of leaders to accept responsibility and accountability.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, I mean, so I guess there's, in some ways it's like in any like hierarchy, if something goes wrong, the people at the bottom are more likely to suffer the consequences than the people at the top.
Yeah, especially in policing. But yeah, that's a universal thing. Yeah. Yeah.
So there's like, what did the Minneapolis police chief resign? I can't tell. I mean, there has been maybe that's the highest ranking.
So also, like Minneapolis too. Talking to a police officer friends of mine, there were a couple of things that shocked cops along with the original incident. First of all, that chokeholds were permitted. That really, we didn't know of departments that were as permissive in chokeholds as Minneapolis. The fact that the cop who killed Floyd had 2 trainees under him, that's also one of the reasons, at least 2. The fourth officer I know nothing about, but one of the cops was 3 days out of the academy. The other was 4 days out of the academy, according to their lawyer. And the killer cop is their training officer. Mm-hmm. But the idea that you would have 2 trainees is unheard of. So there are all these little things like, why? These are the things you have to fix before disaster strikes, before you kill somebody. Minneapolis was, in theory, a reform progressive department. They went through implicit bias training and de-escalation training and reconciliation programs. And, maybe they worked, but they didn't work enough to stop this kind of thing from happening. Mm-hmm. But that's, it's frustrating as someone who follows these things to always be shocked at, Ferguson raises 30+% of their funding from court fines and tickets. Like, what? I had never heard of that before 2015, and I should know better. But the fact that Minneapolis still has weird policies, this is where some type of standardization, whether it's at the state or federal level, really could serve some good, because we do have certain best practices in the field, and it's very... It's disturbing that many departments still don't follow them.
Mm-hmm. Maybe this is not a question you can answer, but do you have any sense of what Chauvin was thinking? Like, I assume he was not like a psychopath who was like, I decided I'm going to murder someone right now on camera. I assume he thought he was doing something that he should be doing.
I am such the right person ask about that? Because in almost all these cases, I can tell you that. Even if I don't believe it, I can, give you that perspective. No, I don't. And that's why it's baffling. It shocks the conscience. I have no idea. And I have never heard, even from a police perspective, a sort of a defense of how he behaved. Mm-hmm. I too presume he didn't set out to murder someone on camera and end up being, jailed for it. But I don't know.
Okay, well let's talk about the defund police, abolish the police thing a little bit. It seems to be catching on as the slogan of this movement, for better or worse. I'd say
it's got traction. I don't think it's catching on, but it's got traction.
Well, people are repeating it, and it's the thing. It could have been banned chokehold.
Minneapolis seems to be moving forward with it. So
it's such a vague term, and then it's this problem with the left where the 3-word slogan eliminates all nuance, and like few people actually believe it. Like believe all women or something. Like no one's like a woman will never lie. Like that doesn't make any sense. So defund the police, abolish the police. When you hear that, what do you think about it?
I'm all for sort of debates on our police. Should police get more money? I don't know. Should police should they get less money? Is it just right? I mean, these are debates we should be having. The idea that we're funding police perfectly is unlikely. But there is a police abolition movement, and it's been around for years, and it's crazy. It's crackpot. It's supported by very few people. And so there's a certain disingenuous aspect to saying, oh, no, we just actually mean to shift funding from one program to the other. Okay, we can, if that's what you mean, but at its core, it is about abolishing police. I think that most people who advocate this would be for giving police less money, even if it weren't shifted to social services. But we do need more money for effective social services. There's a lot of money now, especially in New York City, spent on, ineffective social services. And the one I constantly hold as an example is Department of Homeless Services in New York. That now has a budget of $3 billion. And the homeless problem is worse than ever, despite a massive, so an extra $1 billion couldn't fix the problem for 60,000 homeless people in New York. Mm-hmm. I doubt another $500 million is going to suddenly do it. I mean, because the policy behind it isn't good. That part isn't about funding. But they're very, if we look, there's some should be, and they're both low-hanging fruits and heavy lifts at the same time. We have problems with mental health care in this country. There are problems with quality of life issues related to homeless people in this country. There are problems with education and jobs and healthcare. Okay. If we could tell cops, look, you'll never have to respond to another crazy person again, they would love it. So let's set up a system where they don't have to. Other countries have managed this. It involves good policy, and it will involve some money. We could do it if we chose to. Now, if we set up these systems and demand for police went down, that's when you can start talking about shifting money from policing. But the idea that we're just going to cut policing first, because I don't have faith we're going to make these social situations any better. And, the fact is people still call for police services, and people call for police services disproportionately from poor minority areas. And there was some poll showing support for I don't remember if it was defund or abolish police, but I think it was some poll that just asked the question, and support came out at 16%. So even if that grows a little bit, let's remember it's 16%.
Not a political winner.
No, but it might be because it's allowed 16%. And it's a 16% that could allow politicians to say we're doing something. But, Biden just came out against it, thank God, because it's a sure vote loser. If in the police, there are only 3 organizations in America that constantly have the support of the American public: the military, small business, and police. And it's important to remember that politically for a national election. But the other thing about the poll was that the greatest support was among people making over $100,000 a year, and I'm sick of people telling other people how they should be policed. If support for abolish police comes out of high crime areas, let's listen to it. And if it's the majority, which it's not, black people want more policing, even more than white people want more policing. They also want better policing. And that's, again, it's complicated. There's nuance there. But the idea that police are the problem, and if we get rid of them, that is a very privileged position coming generally from wealthy white people, telling poor minorities how they should be policed. And that needs to be pushed back on. Don't speak for other people like that, because people will die, and it won't be you, and it won't be, here's my other thing is, why not try it in a rich white neighborhood first? Pick some rich suburb and let's abolish the police. Of course, there wouldn't be any political support for it there. But why don't we first start in an area that doesn't have a lot of violence? Because I think there is some good that could come out of, figuring out a new system for diverting calls from police services. But let's not make guinea pigs out of people in dangerous neighborhoods. And this country has a long history of doing that. Sometimes from good intention, sometimes from evil intention. But people need police protection. And, someone's got to answer the call when people call 911. Though I do think, I don't know if we have time for it. The whole system now that people of 911 call and response, I think, perhaps isn't the best way to issue police services. But that's the way we have it. And people want police, and to say we're not going to give it to you is troublesome.
Mm-hmm. And, you mentioned, someone who was mentally ill or seems mentally ill, and, someone calls 911, cops have to deal with this person. Since this is America, it's possible that this person has a gun, either on their person or like in their home. And so just sending some social workers over there to try to deal with a potentially violent person.
Potentially, and that's
could be a bad situation.
Yeah, but most of the situations don't involve violence. So I don't know the percentage, but it's the vast majority. It's the problem is we don't. If someone chooses not to take their meds, we allow them that choice. We have very, I would say, too strict laws prohibiting involuntary commitment. It doesn't have to, be one flew over the cuckoo's nest for life. But some countries, I think it's Sweden, I forget, has a progressive system where you first go in for a day, and then if you draw attention to yourself again, you get 3 days and 7 days. But the idea that we just allow people in crisis to roam the streets, sometimes not hurting other people, but there's also a public community here. Cuomo shut down the New York City subway at night because basically de Blasio wouldn't eject homeless people from it. Along with their petty feud that has, literally killed now tens of thousands of people through COVID. We need rational policy, and there has to be accountability at the social services level. Just to say what we're doing isn't working doesn't mean we shouldn't try. But police are the agency of last resort, and until we can fix the problems, or not fix, but mitigate, because they're, at some point social services people, we'll call police because someone is in crisis and armed. But we're not even close to doing that. Last year, there were a couple tragedies of people in New York City, homeless people who killed people. And in the two cases that I'm thinking of, on both times, the family tried to get that person committed because they needed help. They couldn't get help. And then we had tragedy. There's got to be a better way. And that doesn't involve policing. But we're not addressing those issues.
Right. And I really don't know that much about this particular subject, but it seems like, there was an era in which it was pretty easy to get someone committed to like a relative or something.
Too easy, let's say.
Right. And then maybe like the husband gets the wife committed, on a false claim or something like that, just to get her out of the picture. And so, but then there was this institutionalization that happened in the 70s, where basically these wards were let out. Those
old giant, state homes, there were a lot of old people in there. They became de facto old folks home for people who couldn't afford care. So if you became invalid, there was that. So also we invented medicines that cured a lot of mental problems. So it was a combination of things that allowed deinstitutionalization, but the part that never happened was community-based care. So yeah, we got rid of an evil, but we never fixed it.
Mm-hmm. Let me return, maybe this will be the last thing, to something I mentioned before, of this sense of like the police having lost legitimacy, not only among poor Black people who live in the inner city, but among like my cohort, more or less, of educated white people who are also
and my social circle, I should say.
Okay, well, so say posting ACAB or if you say I don't know if you're supposed to say ACAB or ACAB, but fuck the police basically, and where that was a radical statement when NWA, if I'm correct, who sang that song in 1991, did it. Now it's like if people are like, if you're not saying fuck the police, then maybe like you're secretly a cop. It's just become the standard cultural standard, and so that seems. I don't know. It's interesting and strange that this has happened, and the fault probably lies on multiple sides of bad police behavior and also people kind of performing their radicalism online and stuff like that. But
let's also not forget 5 years now of a pretty constant anti-policing narrative coming from supposedly objective news outlets, be it the New York Times or NPR. Or the Washington Post. There's been a lot of unfair coverage. I think that has influenced people as well.
I mean, how do you see this playing out? I mean, how do your students think about these things?
Well, my students tend to be non-white, first of all. They're all immigrants and kids of immigrants. And they are, it's a selective body of students I teach. It's a school of criminal justice, and I teach policing classes, so a lot of them want to go into law enforcement. They're New York City kids, and they're trying to break into America's working class. That's the primary motivation. They've worked some retail, but no one in their family has ever had a job with benefits, ever. So there is a big class element to this as well. Policing is still by and large working class, even with the fact that in New York you need 2 years of college, and many cops have a bachelor's degree or even a master's degree. But yeah, New York City, it's a lot of good city kids, so they don't quite. I mean, yeah, they don't. I've been to a lot of parties, and I don't see my students at these parties of my friends in Brooklyn. So, I mean, there's a big class divide there. And again, that's what I was talking about earlier is just be careful before you speak for other people, what you think you know best. Even in neighborhoods that have good reason and have seen bad policing, there's a lot more support for cops than I think people realize. Again, and it's not that they don't want better policing, but the problems are real, and we to sort of pretend they don't exist, and that if police simply stopped their systemic oppression, that everything would get better is somewhere. It's both naive and idealistic, and it's just but it's misguided.
Okay, maybe this will be the last question, unless you want to add anything after. If you could snap your fingers and magically, institute a reform in American police, how they behave or whatever, what would that reform be?
In cities, more foot patrol. I'd get cops out of cars, to have more interactions with the public that aren't in an enforcement or crisis mode. I think that would help cops understand the community better and also help the community understand cops better. This idea that policing by and large means sit in a car and wait for someone to call 911, it sort of became the de facto method of policing in America, and no one ever really asked for it. It was supposed to be efficient. That was the main purpose of it. Started in New York in the late 60s. I think that would do a lot. I also think that I want to talk about regional differences briefly because it kind of relates to that, but I don't go off topic. There's an article that just came out in The Atlantic by Seth Stoughton and Jeff Alpert and another Jeff whose name unfortunately I'm forgetting, which is quite good on this subject. It has some sort of specifics, and it's in The Atlantic, so it's not too dry, but it gets into the sort of nitty gritty of what we can do in terms of police reform. In terms of policy levels and training. But my sort of somewhere, my fondness bordering on fetish is to get cops out of cars and more on foot. But you need cops to be, the distinction is, do you want cops to be proactive or reactive? Right now, proactive policing isn't very popular in the reform movement. And cities that have seen reform, like Baltimore, have gotten more violent. So, what we need proactive cops that are being proactive in intelligent ways, that aren't dicks and aren't doing it in a racist way. We need police departments that are able to articulate why there's racial disparity in police enforcement, like there's racial disparity in everything in America. And police respond to the racial disparities and the racism of America. So police departments need to do a better job defending that. But in terms of how we can improve policing on a street level, I'd say that is get cops out of their car when we're walking around. To get rid of bad cops, it does require either changing union rules or, without changing union rules, police department for the first 2 years before cops have civil service protection. Usually, it depends. It usually kicks in after 18 months. It's really easy to fire a cop for those first 18 months. It's almost never done in the academy period and in field training. And then up through civil, so that's 6 months academy, generally 2 months field training, and then year after that, civil service protection kicks in. I don't want a quota because quotas never work out well. But if you had a goal to get rid of the bottom 5-10%, like in any group, the bottom 5 or 10%, I'm avoiding using the term bad apples because it's such a cliche and it's mocked for good reason. But you don't want to have the whole barrel go rotten. And so you got to get rid of those bottom, but there's no incentive now to do that. No one's willing to sort of say, you know what, I'm willing to take the blame. I'm willing to take the inevitable lawsuit, but this person shouldn't be a cop and we're cutting them. If you could do that early on, you could save a lot of heartache later. And then, I'd end the war on drugs, but that's a little more pipe dream. But if we want to talk about what we could do for policing, get them out of the vice business. We need to regulate drugs. We need to regulate prostitution, just as we regulate gambling. Remember, those used to be the three sin crimes or victimless crimes. We've managed pretty well with legalizing gambling, and people still got problems with it. We have to. And I don't just mean decriminalize, because they're quality of life issues. I don't want streetwalkers in front of my house. You have to regulate it, and you can only regulate it once you legalize it, and that is another step. But we could end a lot of urban violence simply by regulating bad drugs and saying, because at some point we have to accept that the status quo isn't working. So there's a few ideas.
Okay. Those make sense to me. I think it's not often emphasized enough that any organization that the bottom 10% of is worse than the top 90%. And, that means that 10% of all cops are in the bottom 10% in terms of how good they are at being cops, and probably the ones that end up getting caught on camera doing something awful were in that bottom 10% who should have been there.
Let me also mention, if I could briefly, one other way, because it's a shame that the bottom 10% are dealing with the public. The fact that patrol, the interaction with the public, what the public thinks of as policing is at the bottom of the organizational ladder is a problem. No one ever gets promoted to patrol. You could flip that around. That's an organizational issue. But the idea that you punish someone by sending them back on the street, there should be a nobility in the idea of being a patrol officer and serving a community for a length of time and getting to know people. That could be, shifted with good leadership in a police department. And there's some union issues as well, because they don't allow pay disparities. But, what if you paid certain cops more to who are willing to walk foot in a certain neighborhood for a long time? But a lot of that was done away with because of there'd be a corruption scandal. And so they would, now they move cops on purpose, on principle, so they don't get to know the community that well, or they do for a couple of years. Generally people serve as precinct commanders in New York City for 2 years. That strikes me as a weird, arbitrary time limit.
Do you mean that the cops would get too friendly with the local malefactors and would end up being on the take or something like that?
Yeah, because that happened in the 70s a lot. That was also before we legalized gambling, and that helped clean up the police department. And there are good analogies there with drugs today. But the idea is that the community can spend 2 years trying to build up a relationship with a commanding officer, but then the commanding officer leaves, and then they got to do it all again with the next commanding officer. And that can, that's not a way to build good long-term relationships.
I think I don't have anything else to ask you. Do you have anything else you wanted to add before we wrap up?
Well, the idea of regional disparities in policing, because it seems like it's so huge and no one ever notices it. And with regards to police shooting and killing people, we focus on racial disparities within cities, which by and large can be explained by police interactions, by disparities in violent crime. What we can't explain are differences between, say, New York City and Albuquerque or Oklahoma City or Tulsa. There are medium-sized cities out west that have levels of cops shooting people that are 20 times New York City.
Wow.
It's night and day. If we want to reduce shootings, we got to focus on where cops are shooting a lot of people. And yet we don't seem to, again, say, well, you know what, some cities are better than others. What is New York City doing that those, and I don't think, well, there'll always be some disparity there as well because of, also they get less, they spend less on cops. That I think, this is a theory. I don't know how I can prove it with hard data, but there's certainly a correlation between less money on policing and more police shootings. And then the simple argument is, you have cops out there alone and they're losing a fight and they shoot somebody. But it also relates to poorer training and so on. But these disparities between states and specifically between cities, we're talking, 20 times difference, not 20%. And nobody looks at these things. If we could reduce California's rate of lethal police-involved shootings to just the national average, we'd save a couple, like 100 and 150, I forget exactly, 200 lives a year. That's a good chunk of the total of 1,000 people shot and killed by police every year. But to do that, we'd have to, I don't want to say move our focus from, but how about in addition to a focus on race, we need to also shift our focus from a laser-like exclusive attention to race and say, because most of these cities that have a really high rates of shootings and states that have high rates of shootings have a lower than average percentage of African Americans. States like New York and Pennsylvania and New Jersey and Michigan and Illinois are lower than have lower meaning better, have lower than national averages of cops shooting and killing people. You're far less likely to be shot as a black man in New York than a white man in Tulsa. It's not even close. And
do you have a theory, or is there a theory about why it might be? Is it culture? Or?
I think it's a combination of more area, less backup, single person patrol, more crystal meth, more gun culture, maybe just a more violent culture, more sort of spread out rural poverty, perhaps. That's why I said I don't think we'd ever change all of that. But certainly we could change some of it. That should kind of, we can make things better. But so like here with defunding police, so if we shifted $1 billion of the New York City $6 billion budget, that would mean firing cops because most of the money is labor. What if that meant cops shot and killed 5 more people a year? It's hard to say, and I don't mean it's direct cause and effect, but I do mean cause and effect. It's just, the mechanisms are more complicated than that. Is that worth it? LA spends a lot less than New York City on cops, and they shoot more people. Mind you, they're not that bad by national standards. But these are sort of the bigger picture things, but no one even talks about it. And, I've sort of casually been mentioning it in whatever blog posts and Twitter. But sometimes I think we're missing the problem that cops in certain places are just shooting too much.
Yeah, that's interesting. I didn't know that fact. So that's good to know. And the things that catch the national attention maybe seem to they have some, weird or grotesque aspects to them, like Freddie Gray in the back of the truck or caught on camera or something. And then like maybe these things that are just kind of regularly happening in parts of the country that don't get a lot of attention. People aren't really.
Well, there's no racial element, so it doesn't make national news. But my God, the way cops have killed some people of all races that I've seen videos of that didn't ever become big deal. And I mean, it tends to be in places like Fresno and Bakersfield, and there's not a lot of press there either. And you also get a political structure that sometimes, especially in small towns, where you'll get the prosecutor on principle, I'll never charge a cop because I know the police chief, and we both love Trump, and so there's no pushback to a lot of these shootings. It's like no one cares. Sometimes the family, there'll be a little protest from the family, but but there are really some. I mean, yeah, George Floyd level shockingness.
Okay, Peter, thank you for coming on and enlightening me and the audience about some of these important matters. So you're on Twitter. What is your Twitter handle?
I think it's Peter Moskos. I'm not certain.
I think it is too, but I was thinking there was an underscore in there, but maybe I'm wrong. But search for Peter Moskos and you will come up.
I should write something on my blog, which is copinthehood.com, and that's the book about policing in Baltimore. It's 20 years ago now, but still, it's stood the test of time pretty well.
Yeah, it's on my long list of books to read. And like I said, I read In Defense of Flogging and found it quite interesting.
Okay, if I get a bump in sales for Greek Americans, I'll thank you.
Check out Greek Americans too. I never heard of it before today, but it sounds interesting. Okay, so thanks for coming on. Thank you to all of our viewers and listeners, and we'll see you again next time.
Thanks for a good discussion.